the idea for women in especially sports broadcasting is that the target audience is 18 to 34-year-old males. And once you're over 35, you're not hot enough to be on the air anymore. Now, they've gotten caught on this, which is why you see older women still being sportscasters. In my time, it's like, no, I worked for 5 TV stations and suddenly I couldn't get a job anywhere in the country.
Jeez.
So, yeah, you're just not hot enough anymore. And I'll tell you the honest truth. I was depressed. I didn't want to see anybody I knew. I went from anchoring SportsCenter to coming back to Phoenix and officiating Pop Warner football and Little League because it's the only skills I had that anybody would pay for.
Wow.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you hit the subscribe button, it'll help us out a lot. Thanks again.
So I mentioned, your background in broadcasting, etc. But before we get to that, I want to jump to Your Forgotten Sons book, which I've read some of. That's online. You can only read so much. How did that come about? I know what it's about, but just for the listeners, how did Your Forgotten Sons come about?
I had a dear friend who worked at the first TV station I worked at in Columbus, Georgia. And Regina called me one day and she said, I have to have a surgery on my spine. She said, there's a chance I might be paralyzed from the waist down. And I need you to come to Baltimore to Johns Hopkins Hospital to be my healthcare power of attorney. And I said, of course, she was my best friend. And so I flew there, and the night before the surgery, she hands me this Ziploc bag full of 75-year-old letters. And she said, whatever happens to me, promise me that you'll tell Bud's story. And of course, I was like, I wanted her to feel better. I'm like, yes, of course, I'll write a book about Bud. And then, of course, she had the surgery. She had a tumor around her spinal cord. They removed it. She walked out of the hospital, and I had made this promise that I would write about this man who served in the Graves Registration Service in World War II. Now, most people don't know what that means, but the Graves Registration Service, those are the guys who had to locate, identify, and bury the dead. Now, when you read books and you see movies, we see battles and guys shooting each other and planes falling from the skies, but we don't see what happens next because at some point, someone has to pick up the pieces. And the Graves registration men were those people. And if you think about D-Day, and Bud Richardville was at Normandy, 10,000 people died, both Allies and Germans that day. Well, they couldn't leave those bodies there. They had the Allies funneled 186,000 servicemen through that area. You had to pick the pieces up because, quite honestly, it's a health hazard, but it's also a morale problem. You can't have these young men coming off going, oh my God, their bodies everywhere. So his job was to locate, identify, and bury the dead. And it was something most of these men never spoke about. They were embarrassed. Most of them said, we want to go and, be real soldiers. And it was horrible. Now, people go to Normandy today, and there's a magnificently beautiful, graceful cemetery there, as there are in 26 nations worldwide, where American servicemen and women are buried. Sure. And Bud and his men built that. They built those cemeteries, those beautiful, graceful, honorable places that these service people are buried today. So I wrote a book about who he was. And how did I learn that? The letters he sent home. And the title, by the way, is Your Forgotten Sons. His last letter home to his mother was signed Your Forgotten Son.
Wow.
And Regina and I decided that all those people have been forgotten, that you don't see them in movies or books. Nobody wants to talk about them. So we dedicated it to all of them. There's also a couple of love stories in this. I don't know. He married a woman he barely knew 2 weeks before he shipped out. And that was a common problem. Young soldiers did that. We're not sure why. Maybe they're worried they're going to die or whatever. But Bud was 28, so he was older because he worked in the paper mills in Michigan. And the paper mills were required. I mean, they were one of those industries that was required by the military. So he was deferred till he was older. And then at 28, he was drafted, and he was immediately made a sergeant. I think because all the guys he was serving with were very young. I mean, guys 10 years younger might have been were like a different generation. So he became a sergeant right away. And the story follows his marriage, which was hugely crazy. And then also, there were quiet family rumors that there was another woman in Europe at the time during the war. So now understand, this is inspired by a true story, which is very different than is based on a true story. Based means we know exactly what happened. We know what people said. It was documented. We know who his friends were. We know everything, the truth of all it. This is not that. This is inspired. It's inspired by his letters, which means I took literary license. I created friends for him. I created maybe who a woman might have been that he met in Europe. His wife, we know some about, but that I don't want to share too much about that because it's a
Sure.
very weird story. So it is Bud's story, and it was very difficult to write because it is necessarily gruesome, as you can imagine, in some parts. The Graves registration guys followed all the big battles. He was at the Battle of the Bulge, which the deadliest battle in the history of the war, I think. And they also liberated the death camps. So those were the guys that had to go in and straighten that up. So it was an impossible job, and they never got any credit for it. And I'm very delighted that this past summer in Vincennes, Indiana, we held a memorial service for Bud. He remains in Europe. He's buried in Epinal, France, buried by his same guys that he worked with. And we had a service for him, and they had a proclamation that it was Bud Richardville Day in Vincennes, and they honored his service, and that had never happened before. And it wasn't just gathering Allied dead; it was German dead. It was. I'll give you an example. And, I don't want to scare people away, but there are some gruesome parts here.
Sure.
Bottom line is, there's a city called Brest, France, and the Allied, that was a submarine base there, and the Germans took the town over to put their submarines there so they could control the North Sea and the Channel. And the Americans came in and said, "Look, we're going to bomb this. We're going to bomb this. Please, everybody, leave." Okay, and the French didn't leave. Instead, they had caverns underneath the town, and they set up a hospital, and they set up beds. And so when the bombing began, they all went underground. Problem was, there was a fire, and the Germans even went down there to escape, and we basically bombed it to dust. And so weeks and weeks later, some of our Graves registration men were sent there to go clean out the tunnels. 6 weeks, 2 months after the burning. And there were bodies like 3 deep. There were babies in mothers' arms. And the French people said, "We want you to go in and take out the Germans, and then we're going to seal it up as a mass grave." And our guys had to go down there and figure out who, in the dark, to figure out who was German and bury them in a mass grave. Now, you're probably going to say, how do I know this? Because Bud did not write about these things. Most soldiers did not write about what they were doing because they were censors. And besides that, none of these guys wanted to admit what they were doing. They were embarrassed by it. But I found one book called Crosses in the Wind that was written by a Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Schumann, who was a captain in the Graves Registration Service for 18 months during World War II. And he wrote about the things they actually did. And I got a copy of that book, and I read it, and I used Schumann's memories and put Bud in those places. Could Bud have been at Brest, France? Could he have been at Dachau? Could he, yes, he could have been in any of those places, because these guys were shared. They said, "Okay, we just had this huge battle, send 100 guys to, whatever town." And that was their job. And, today, if someone dies in battle, we send them home. We send them home right away, in 48 hours or however quickly. Back then, you just couldn't do it in a world war. There was no way to send guys home. And so they were buried, and often exhumed several times and reburied. When after Normandy, they had to build a gravesite right up by the beaches. And then they had to go back a long time later, exhume the bodies and put them in the grave in the where they're buried today at Normandy. So it was a difficult book. I can't tell you it was easy, but it's Bud's story too. It's about him as a human being. So I don't want people to be too scared away because it's gruesome. But I felt if I didn't tell the honest truth, I couldn't candy coat it. It would not be paying homage to those men.
Mm. Now, I'm assuming that there's still this organization within the military. I mean, someone still has to do that, right?
Yeah, today it's called Mortuary Services. I think it changed leading into Vietnam, But as again, it's entirely different today. Same because the bodies get sent home quickly, but someone's got to go out there. When you
Exactly.
have when you think about Vietnam and a lot of these guys after victory in Europe, they got shipped out to Japan to the Philippines. And it's bad enough dealing with bodies when it's cold, like the Battle of the Bulge when it's freezing. But now go to the jungles and try to find people.
Brutal.
And
Mm.
yeah, a horrendously horrible job, and they still have it. Mortuary services. Somebody's got to pick up the dead.
How'd you get into television broadcasting?
I'm kind of a freak because I was a sportscaster. I started in 1983. And so my mother marched up to me and said, "So you got to go to college. We got to pick a school. What do you want to be?" And I said, "I want to be a sportscaster." And she said, "Don't be ridiculous. I'm trying to have a serious conversation with you." I said,
Really?
"Well, Mom, that's what I want to be." And everybody told me no, I could never be that thing. Went to college, went to Miami of Ohio. They said, "You will never be a sportscaster. You're a woman." And yet, my senior year, they allowed me to co-host a sports TV show with a guy. And I went, "Great, I'm finally going to get a shot." Well, the football coach, the basketball coach, and the baseball coach all refused to speak to me. They would not be interviewed by me. They refused. And so I went, "Well, what am I supposed to do now?" And people don't understand this. They look at me like, "Well, there are women in sports." Not then. There weren't any. This was 1976, 77, I guess.
I
And
remember, I mean, 70s. I actually grew up in Pittsburgh, but there was some women on TV. I
yes,
can
and
see
it
her
was
face
Phyllis
now.
George. Phyllis
Yes,
George
exactly.
was Miss America.
Yes,
Okay, and
exactly.
it wasn't her fault. And they
No,
would put her
no,
in a fur coat and she'd stand on the sidelines and interview the coach's wife.
exactly. Right, right,
So it
right.
wasn't because she knew about sports. It was because she was a stunningly beautiful woman standing on the
Hmm.
sidelines. They
Hmm.
were not being real open-minded here. So when I was in college, what I realized was there are other teams in a college. We had archery and swimming and gymnastics and hockey and all these other teams that no one paid a bit of attention to. So I went to all those teams and they were thrilled. They didn't care that I was a woman. They were
Nice.
delighted to get coverage. So when I graduated, I couldn't get a job anywhere. I went to Washington, D.C. and worked in a bar in Georgetown. It was great fun. It was the 80s after all. So I decided to become a certified amateur official in the 5 main team spectator sports: football, baseball, ice hockey, soccer, and basketball. I decided I would do that for 5 years and that I would know the games by then and that some forward thinking news director would give me a job. And that's exactly what happened. And I was very fortunate that my first TV partner was a wonderful guy who wasn't offended by the fact, maybe he was offended by the fact that I got the sports director job above him, but he taught me what I needed to do. I made a lot of horrible mistakes, and I've learned that it's really good to be 1,000 miles away from anyone you know when you're on television because it's better if everybody's a stranger. So, but since then, I worked at 4 other TV stations until I was pushing 40 when I was no longer pretty enough to be on camera because that's what happens to women.
Well, how did the ESPN gig come about? Because that's
um,
a pretty big deal, right? I mean,
Well, it was. I worked in Columbus, Georgia. I worked in Rochester, New York. Then I went to Phoenix. I was in Phoenix 2 years, and had a great news director, by the way, because I came and the Arizona Cardinals moved here right when I got here, and he made me their beat reporter, which was amazing. That meant I traveled with the team. I covered them every day. And then we were talking 1988. Actually, they came here. I guess yeah, their first season would have been '88. So I was very fortunate, and I got to cover all kinds of sports here, which was great. Um, and I got a call from my agent one day, and he said, one of the guys at ESPN saw you on the air, and they want to hire you. It was that simple.
wow,
It was no fun at all.
really?
None. No. They hired women because they felt they had to. It was that you have to give women a chance. You have to have diversity, and they don't want to do that. I mean,
Really?
no, and it really. I mean, I'll give you some examples.
Wow.
Are you a baseball fan?
Yeah. I mean, I love all sports.
Okay, so I was an umpire for 25 years, right? And I worked all levels of. I was an amateur official. But my favorite game was I worked the San Francisco Giants and the Phoenix Firebirds. I have my lineup card with Dusty Baker and Barry Bonds, and so I mean I'm a good umpire. And I'm on the air one night live in SportsCenter. If you're lucky, you get to see all your highlights before you go on. But sometimes that doesn't happen with a late show. They just, some production assistant, which are just kids right out of college, desperate to be in TV. And they run in and throw highlights in front of you, while you're live on the air. And so that happened to me one night. And I go, okay, let's go to Wrigley Field. I didn't have a chance to look ahead. And the first shot says, "Oh, a guy got hit by a foul tip in the front row at Wrigley Field." And a guy's, got hit with the ball. Well, I know this is a mistake, but I don't have time to correct it because I have to move on to the next highlight. So at the end of every sports center, there's something called a post-mortem. And the post-mortem is where everybody in the show sits around a big conference table. We discuss what went well, what went poorly, and what can we do better.
That's where
And
Bud
so,
shows up.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So I raised my hand. I said, "Well, Rich," I called over the production assistant. I said, "We need to talk about that first play." And he goes, "What do you mean, though? The guy that got hit by the foul tip?" I said, "Rich, he wasn't hit with a foul tip. That's impossible. A foul tip is a ball that goes from the bat to the catcher's glove, is caught. It's a strike, but it's a live ball. That means if some guy's stealing home, the umpire has to stop and wait, and you can make a play on him. A foul ball is a dead ball. It goes out of play." So the guy that got hit in the front row got hit with a foul ball. There's silence. Not one guy said anything. And finally, the producer goes, "Is it that big a deal?" I said, "Well, yeah, it is that big a deal." And Rich gets up and he goes, "You're nothing but a picky bitch." I said,
Jesus.
"No." I said, "I'm an umpire." I said, "And some people either know I'm an umpire, and that's a big mistake. Okay, because it's a live ball. Foul tip, foul ball, two different things." And he
Wow.
stomped out. Not one guy defended me. And the next day I got called into my boss's office and I was ordered to apologize to Rich because I hurt his feelings.
Sounds like today.
Well, I was like, but I'm right. I mean, I'm an umpire. I understand this. And wouldn't you think ESPN would want it to be right?
You would think.
Yeah, and then this was before the internet. I know people don't believe there was a time before then, but there was. So we didn't have access to every bit of information constantly. But there was a guy at ESPN named Howie, and for months I didn't know who this guy was. He just wandered around the newsroom all the time. And then I found out he was the information guy. You could ask him any question about any sport in the history of the planet, and he could answer it. And if he couldn't answer it in a second, he could go find it. So I never dealt with Howie. And then one day I was on a time crunch and I had to find a piece of information. I don't remember what the information was at this point. And I said, "Howie," because he walked right by my desk and he said, "Here's the information." And so I went on the air. The next day, my boss calls me and he goes, "Why did you say that live on the air?" I went, "What are you talking about?" He gave me the piece of information. I said, "Oh," and I paused because I didn't want to throw Howie under the bus, thinking that he made an error of some kind. And then I see him standing in the
Sure.
doorway and he's smiling at me. And I said, "Howie gave me that information before I went on the air." And Howie said, "I never told her anything."
Wow.
So now I can't use the guy with all the information. It was that kind of stuff.
So at that time, I mean, I grew up, I'm in Pittsburgh. I'm watching sports. I love sports. I've seen Sports Center. I've seen you, but I mean, who was there recognizable name, so to speak, that was good? You know what I mean? Like,
Oh, there were
I'm trying
plenty.
to think. I'm trying to think of
Plenty good. Mike
well.
Tirico was my first long-term
Okay.
partner. We worked 6 months, 8 months together. He's a
Okay.
good guy. Dan Patrick, great guy.
Oh, okay.
Who's my buddy who does college football? I shared it. Fowler, Chris Fowler, very nice man. Please don't get the impression that everybody was mean. They weren't. But
No, no.
we're all it's hard to like say anybody was buddies with anyone. We're all in a hurry. Doing
Sure.
the news every night is manic craziness.
I can
So,
imagine.
yeah, no, I don't want to give the impression that there weren't some good people. There were.
Yeah, great, great. Now, who do you admire in the broadcasting universe, whether it's now or back then? I mean, I know you named some just now, but
Um,
who do you look at and say, now that's the way to do it, man or female?
that's hard. That's hard for me because I'll be truly honest with you. The last 5, 6 years, I don't pay as much attention as I used to. I've sort of fallen out of paying much attention.
How about
Uh,
when you were broadcasting, you know,
I really
And,
didn't. I really didn't. Honestly, I didn't watch that much. It sounds absurd
too
that
busy doing your thing, right?
yeah, when I was working in the bar, I officiated, I mean, sometimes 2 sports a season. I might be doing hockey and baseball at the same time. The seasons overlapped or football and I mean, it was crazy, and I worked nights in a restaurant, so I'll be honest, and then once I was in TV, I didn't have time to watch anybody else in TV because,
Oh,
today there are women direct producers, there's women camera people, there's women and no one even blinks an eye, but I was always the only one. And so sometimes it was awkward, especially in locker rooms and that kind of thing, which nobody should go into locker rooms except athletes. I really think we shouldn't. I think they should be left alone, but I think they should also have to come and talk to us because too many times they sneak out. So, bottom line is, I honestly can't think of anybody. I just know some people were nice. Chris Berman's a great guy. Um, some were nice and some were not.
as far as interviewing athletes, which sport do you think are the most cordial athletes? Not that the other ones are evil,
I,
but I mean,
I
in
don't think
general.
it's a sport by sport thing. I think it's a human thing.
Hmm.
I've been in situations where athletes have saved my butt, and they didn't have to. And I don't know if you remember Manute Bol,
Oh, yeah,
um,
sure.
and I didn't know him.
Yeah.
I was
Interview
covering.
them like this.
Yeah, I was covering the NBA playoffs. Um, uh, the Suns were playing Golden State, and I had to do a feature on Manute Bol for the news. And I'll never forget. This was a good bad guy, good guy thing because I was with a whole bunch of media people from Phoenix, and we all travel together. We all have drinks together. And the night before, I'd asked one of the other local guys from Phoenix what time the press conference was the next morning. He said 10 o'clock. I said great. So my camera guy and I showed up at 9:30, and the press conference is over.
Really?
Yeah, and that guy was waiting for me. He was sitting in a chair with his hands behind his head and his feet stretched out. He goes, "Oh, are we a little late for the press conference?" And I went, "Crap." And he did it on purpose. And my cameraman was a big guy, and I thought he was going to hurt him. And I'm standing there going, "How am I going to get my piece done for the 5 o'clock news?" And at that point, the media woman, it was a woman at that point, which was rare back then, came out, and I explained what happened, that I had a problem and I needed to see Manute Bol. And she said, "Look, he's done for the day. He really, it's time for him to go home." But she goes, "But I'll tell him you're here, but I can't guarantee anything." Damn if Manute Bol didn't come out, and he was charming and kind. And you're right, I held my microphone up and barely touched his, could pass the middle of his chest. But he didn't have to do that. He didn't know me from anybody, but he took his own personal time and saved me. And those are the things I remember. And some guys are just nice people. Jim Abbott, what a great guy. You remember Jim
Mhm.
Abbott, the
Oh,
pitcher
yeah,
with
yeah.
one with
With
one
the
arm?
arm. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, back in August, I fell and broke my arm in 3 places and had pins, and I was so upset and so angry I couldn't function. And then I remembered an interview with Jim Abbott, and I had him on a beautiful sunny day in spring training here in Scottsdale, and I said, how do you do things? Because he had one arm, and he
One arm.
said, "Look,
Yeah.
my parents did not spoil me. My parents said, figure it out." And I asked, I said, "How do you tie your shoes?" He said, "You just keep trying till you tie your shoes." And so I thought of him when I couldn't tie my shoes. And he was the nicest guy in the world. He said he got into sports because he didn't want to be different. And
Wow.
so it's those memories that I have that make all of that worthwhile.
I know you're out of the field, so to speak, but do you think journalism has changed for the better?
Of course not. If you're talking about any journalism, I mean, it used to be if you didn't have 3 people verify a piece of information, you didn't go with it. You
Really?
had to have proof. You didn't go on a hunch. You didn't go because you want to be the first that reported something. You reported on truth. And I ended up teaching journalism for a long time. It horrifies me that nobody seems to care whether something's true or not. It's
Mm-mm.
all about, well, if I get it first, that makes me great, and if I have to retract it later, who cares? That would have never flown back then.
Do you think you
Uh,
need a degree in journalism
Not at all.
nowadays?
No,
Wow.
no, because honestly, No one needs a degree in journalism. You need to know how to write. And that's what people don't understand about sports broadcasting. I taught sports broadcasting briefly at Arizona State University, and they were shocked. I said, the most important thing in broadcasting is, can you tell a story? Can you write a story? Because we all say what we write. I'm not talking about guys doing live games. That's different. I'm talking about, I'm doing Sports Center. All those are written stories that we have to write ahead of time. So in the course of any day, I might write dozens of stories. Some might be 15 seconds long. Some might be a minute and a half. Some might be 4 minutes. It depends on what you're doing. But we have to tell stories. You have to be a writer. And they're always shocked about that. They think, oh, no, you can just have your microphone and talk. No, you can't. That's not how that works. You have to be a writer.
Do you remember a story at ESPN, or your time at ESPN, that was like I don't know, a worldwide, death of an athlete or something that was a really big story that you had
Well,
to go on the air for?
Magic announced he had AIDS. I mean, that
Uh,
was pretty big.
yeah,
Um,
still
uh,
alive.
yeah, Magic. Talk about Magic. Magic. Who also was a great guy.
Okay.
He's a good guy too. I can't. It's a blur. I
You weren't
mean,
there for the OJ debacle, right?
no, no. Where was I? See, I don't know. I worked
That's
about
95.
10 years in live television. Oh, what year was OJ?
95 is
Yeah,
when
no,
he.
I was not. I was a print reporter by then.
Okay.
I told you once the idea for women in especially sports broadcasting is that the target audience is 18 to 34-year-old males. And once you're
Mhm.
over 35, you're not hot enough to be on the air anymore. Now,
Hmm.
they've gotten caught on this, which is why you see older women still being sportscasters. In my time, it's like, no, I worked for 5 TV stations and suddenly I couldn't get a job anywhere in the country.
Jeez.
So, yeah, you're just not hot enough anymore. And I'll tell you the honest truth. I was depressed. I didn't want to see anybody I knew. I went from anchoring Sports Center to coming back to Phoenix and officiating Pop Warner football and Little League, because it's the only skills I had that anybody would pay for.
Wow.
I did later end up working with the Suns for 2 seasons, but that was part time. That was just during the NBA season. That was fun. But yeah, I really didn't want to see anyone I knew because I didn't want them to say, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm back to officiating kids." And I will
Hmm.
say this: I became an official so I could become a sportscaster. I never thought I'd be an official for 40 years, but I got hooked on it. I called my last high school football game in 2019. The last 24 years, I was a referee and crew chief. So, how many referees on a football field? Trick
A
question.
bunch. Yeah.
Give me a number.
Oh, well, referees or officials?
There you go. That's the difference. It's the same in Pop Warner and the NFL. Okay,
Mhm.
so at the last 24 years of my career, I was the referee and crew chief, which means I wore the white hat. I said holding 76 offense and signal and talk to the press box. I
Mhm.
was in charge. I miss that desperately. I don't miss TV. I was a teacher for 20 years. I don't miss that. I miss Friday night football.
Wow. How was the coin, the paycheck at ESPN? I mean, when you went there, was it substantially more than a TV station in, I don't know, you know,
Well, it,
Arizona?
it was, but it was nothing that they paid the men. I never
Really?
made what the men made. Okay. And then ESPN periodically fires a whole bunch of people at a time, mostly because they are making too much money. Usually sign a 2-year deal and then it goes to another 2-year deal. So they get rid of a lot of people and hire new people at lower rates. So I don't know. I just know as you go up in market size. So my first Columbus, Georgia was the 109th market in the country. I went from there to Rochester, New York, lovely town, 69th market. So I made a lot more there. I made more than double what I made in Georgia. Then I went to Phoenix and made a lot more because Phoenix was close to being a top 20 market at that point. So as you go, it's like minor league baseball. Okay, you start out in an A-ball town, and
Sure.
you eat crap food and you stay in bad hotels, and then Double A is a little better and Triple A is better, but everybody wants to be in the major leagues. And I guess I spent a couple of years in the major leagues at ESPN.
What, if you could go back in time and just morph into a professional official, one sport, which would it be?
Oh, football probably. Now,
Really?
originally baseball was my favorite. I loved baseball. Uh, but I will be deadly honest with you. I never want to get hit with another baseball.
So if you could flash back to college, the young Anne Montgomery,
Yes.
what would you change, if anything? I mean, I know it's a hypothetical, but
I I have very few regrets, very few things I'd change. I don't know. I just
advice for anyone that's in the. I
keep
mean,
going, keep going. It was mostly when I was out of college that it was frustrating. I mean, my family disowned me for a couple years. My parents came down to Washington and tried to convince me to go back to college because I was such an embarrassment that I was a waitress. And I said, "No." I said, "You don't understand." I said, I'm a referee and an umpire, and I'm going to be a sportscaster." And they said, "No, you're not." My mother did. My dad didn't. My mother did. And she said, "We'll send you back to school. You can be a teacher." I said, "I don't want to be a teacher. I want to be a sportscaster." And she said, "You're embarrassing us. What are we supposed to say when people ask about you?" Like, tell them I'm going to be a sportscaster and that I'm a referee.
writing or reading?
Oh, how can I pick that? That would be 50-50.
Come on.
Okay, writing, because writing gives me joy. Reading entertains me.
Okay. Pizza or pasta?
How can you do this? How can I pick that?
That's easy. Come on.
Pasta.
Yes. Finally,
I grew
someone
up
says
with
pasta.
my dear friend growing up, a huge Italian family from Sicily. They adopted me. Yeah, I got to say the pasta.
Got to go pasta.
Mhm.
Cat or dog?
I can't do that. I have 4 cats and 2 dogs, and we
Sounds like
don't
a
get.
cat thing.
No, that's just how many show up here.
All
No,
right.
we've had no, can't do that one. I'm pleading the fifth.
I may know the answer to this. I could be wrong. Ocean or desert?
It might surprise you to know that I can't pick that either. I
This is an
love.
outrage.
I know. Look, I'm a scuba diver. I live in the Caribbean. I go out my back door and there is the Caribbean. I love that. But I love if you've never been in the Sonoran Desert, which is where Phoenix is,
Mhm.
outside of the city, not in the city. It is magnificently beautiful. And I have a heart, and quite honestly, I love the mountains too. I'm an outdoor girl. I like wilderness areas. I'm a mineral collector, which means I don't get to mineral collect in the Virgin Islands, but here in Arizona, I do. I get to go out in wilderness areas. I love it out there. So I'm not picking that either.
Oh my God, it's an outrage. Driver or passenger?
Passenger,
Art museum or history museum?
history museum,
Credit card or cash?
credit card, but I pay in
No.
full every month, no interest.
You have a celebrity crush, or did you ever have a celebrity crush?
Jason Momoa is kind of hot.
Who?
Jason Momoa, Aquaman.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Not
Wasn't
really.
looking. Any profession you would like to have tried that you haven't?
Yes, I'd like archaeology. I,
Wow.
I I love history and I love ancient history. In fact, I have a book coming out that's about a man who was buried outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, 900 years ago. And they call him the magician. And I have a novel coming out. It was actually published a while back, but now it's being republished. So that just got accepted and should be coming out sometime. And yeah, it's archaeology. So I had to study pots and weapons and yeah. In another life, I'd be an archaeologist.
Now your Forgotten Sons is self published or published?
Oh no, all my books are traditionally published. I have real publishers. No, I don't have to
Mm,
pay the bills.
cool. Favorite season of the year, if you had to pick one.
Well, when I lived in the East, it would be fall.
Favorite food?
Chocolate. Is that a food?
It works for me. uh, Advice for a younger you.
Don't take everything so seriously. It will work out.
There you go.
Yeah.
Good advice. Good advice. Now the book, Your Forgotten Sons.
I have a website, AnneMontgomeryWriter.com. That's Anne with an E. And there's a universal link to 10 places you can buy it. So you can get it pretty much anywhere.
Appreciate you coming on, Anne. This has been great.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. If you hit the subscribe button, it'll help us out a lot. Thanks again.